Well, thank you very much, Alex and Ryan, and the Toronto Railway Museum for inviting me to speak about royal tours and rail journeys in the life and reign of King Charles III. There is so much to say about the King's relationship with Canada, but also the transformation of rail journeys over time, the experience of railways. King Charles III's early years coincided with very much the rise of the car and mass highways and the decline of rail journeys within the context of royal tours. However, there are still royal tours that involve railways, and we've seen King Charles III become engaged with steam trains as part of heritage, cultural manifestations of how the uh, the train has affected history and popular culture, regional transit as opposed to these very long distance travels that took place in the past. So there's a great deal to say about train journeys in this time, and we will be going all the way from 1948, when the future King Charles III was born, and the railways were nationalized in the United Kingdom, a circumstance that lasted until Margaret Thatcher was prime minister in the 80s. So we're going all the way through from 1948 to the 21st century, where trains continue to be significant, but the royal train itself, which has existed since the time of Queen Victoria, will be decommissioned. And that's where we're going to begin with the decommission of the Royal Train. And that was the big announcement last June that the Royal Train will be taken out of service by 2027 in a cost-saving measure announced by Buckingham Palace. There have been dedicated trains for monarchs since Queen Victoria's reign, but as part of a drive to ensure that we deliver value for money, it's been decided to decommission the historic rolling stock. The announcement came alongside the annual publication of Royal Finances, which showed that a journey on the Royal Train from Gloucestershire to Staffordshire and then London over 2 days in February had cost more than £44,000. The royal family will still travel on regular train services, and the annual report showed 141 helicopter trips were taken last year, costing £475,000. And this was in the BBC in June. The British press often discusses the cost of royal engagements, as these kinds of office expenses are covered by the sovereign grant, which comes from a percentage of the revenue from the crown lands that goes through the treasury. And because this goes through the treasury, it's very much viewed in Britain as taxpayers' money, whereas revenue from the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall, this is viewed as private money, though of course there has been scrutiny as well about taxes paid by members of the royal family on this land. Should the Duchy of Cornwall be taxed as a corporation, for example? So royal finances and royal transportation, there is often this intersection in terms of how they're debated in the British press. And as in the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, when it was decided that the royal yacht Britannia had reached the end of its life in 1997, in the reign of Charles III, the royal train was seen as reaching the end of the road at that particular, or the end of the rail at that particular time. And in the next reign, it's likely we'll be talking about helicopter trips and the cost there. Of course, yeah, both Prince Harry and Prince William being helicopter pilots. That certainly helicopter trips have become more prominent in terms of royal transport in recent years. But it's important to note that there are still going to be helicopter, in addition to the helicopter trips, there will be travels on regular train services. Certainly, more junior members of the family have always traveled by regular train. Queen Elizabeth II's cousin, Prince Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, has long spoken about how he is able to travel with a senior's rail card on regular train services. Then he tends not to be recognized until he is there opening the bridge or the town hall or whichever royal engagement that he is undertaking. So trains will continue to be significant, but we are not going to be seeing a designated royal train, which has been the case since Queen Victoria's reign. Now, when we talk about a royal train, often people imagine plush opulence, the Orient Express. And certainly there were monarchs who made use of more lavish circumstances on the royal train. King Edward VII, for instance, was interested in very plush Edwardian interiors, but that was not the case for King Charles III or Queen Elizabeth II. The current royal train was refurbished in the 1970s, and so we can see there are some similarities to the decor on the Royal Yacht Britannia. You can visit the Royal Yacht Britannia as a museum ship in Leith in it, where it has been outside of Edinburgh and the Port of Leith since decommission in 1997. So comparatively modest interiors. This is what was known as the Prince of Wales's Lounge before King Charles III came to the throne. The very long sort of formica dining table there in the dining room. There have been many times when travel by train has been absolutely necessary over the course of the 20th century. One example of that being during the Second World War for King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, when they were traveling across England, often to bombed out places. They didn't want anyone whose neighborhood had recently been bombed to feel as though they needed to host a royal visit. So the royal train served as accommodation in that particular context. And then more recently in the COVID-19 pandemic, when the now Prince and Princess of Wales, William and Catherine, then the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, undertook public engagements at a safe social distance, but were able to maintain their bubble within the royal train. So there have been some very important uses for the royal train, but going forward, there will be royalty taking ordinary train travels, scheduled train services, rather than making use of this quite unique royal train that, as I say, there have been versions of the royal train all the way back to Queen Victoria's time, when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert traveling by train was a signal that that train travel was safe, as many people were uneasy in the 1840s as they had never traveled, faster than the speed of horseback, and there were all sorts of concerns about the health risks of traveling at train-like speeds. And once Queen Victoria was traveling by train with her husband and children, that reassured everyone else. A very long and illustrious history for this royal train that's going to be decommissioned in 2027. So here's the future King Charles III. He's born in 1948. And he is, of course, the eldest son of the future Queen Elizabeth II, then Princess Elizabeth, and Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, who at the time of his marriage was, Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten. His mother, Alice of Battenberg, her name was anglicized as Mountbatten, and that was the name that he used in Britain. We can see the proud grandparents here as well, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother. Um, so we can see in this particular context that the future King Charles III was born in to this very close, loving royal family, and he spent a lot of time with his grandparents during his early childhood as Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. They spent time in Malta on the naval base there, and they undertook a visit to Canada in 1951. King George VI passes away of lung cancer and thrombosis in 1952, and then Queen Elizabeth II succeeds to the throne. So there's a few images of her coronation there. We see a very young Prince Charles there between his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and his aunt, Princess Margaret, looking like he's finding the ceremony to be a bit long. And then we have the balcony with little Prince Charles and little Princess Anne as well. And Princess Anne has said that one of her earliest memories was knowing that something was happening and that Charles was getting to attend, and she was not. And she was not particularly pleased about that, but she was there for the balcony appearance. So all this is happening, the early childhood of Prince Charles, at a time when everything was changing for the railways in the UK that had been hit very, badly, literally, by the Second World War. So the Railways Archive in the UK notes that by the end of the war, the railways were worn out both physically and financially. Clement Attlee's Labour government came to power in July 1945 with a large majority and a mandate to nationalize the railways, as well as almost every other form of public transport. The Transport Act 1947 was passed despite substantial opposition and brought virtually all railways, including London Underground, under the control of the British Transport Commission. Railway shares were exchanged for British transport stock with a guaranteed 3% return chargeable to the BTC. This would prove to be a significant burden to the BTC's finances. Under the BTC, the railway executive was charged with running the railways, although the name British Railways came into immediate use for day-to-day purposes. On January 1st, 1948, the nationalized railway was born, and the railway executive's immediate task was to bring the railways back to the point where they could operate effectively. The war had taken a heavy toll on both rolling stock and infrastructure. Funds were not available for full modernization, so a set of standardized steam locomotive and rolling stock designs were quickly drawn up by a series of ideal stock committees. From 1951, about 900 standard steam locomotives were produced to fill the gap that the war had left. So a big boom in building train carriages and trains around this time. So we can see on this particular image here that we get our map of just how many rail lines there were in England, Scotland, and Wales in 1948. So we sometimes think the Second World War happens, everyone's traveling by car, but in Britain, where distances are not all of that far apart, you can get from London to Yorkshire in 3 hours or London to Scotland in 5 hours. That we see the railways continuing to be very significant after the Second World War. I mentioned previously Queen Elizabeth II succeeds to the throne in 1952, and the royal train was very significant to how royal engagements were undertaken. We can see here little Prince Charles and little Princess Anne peering out the window of a royal train, and a slightly older Prince Charles looking out the window of a train in Weymouth, near the seaside in Dorset, with Queen Elizabeth II standing close by. So train journeys were very much part of the royal calendar, traveling up to Scotland to get to Aberdeen, to reach Balmoral Castle. The train journeys were very significant there. But ordinary royal engagements, there was a lot of emphasis on the royal train. And for Queen Elizabeth II, the train, like the royal yacht, was a space where she could be off duty in between royal engagements and have some space of her own amidst this very busy public life. Prince Charles, the future King Charles III, is the first heir to the throne to attend school with other children from a young age. He receives his early education until the age of 8 from a governess, and then he goes to the Cheam School and then to Gordonston in Scotland, which is where Prince Philip had attended. For Prince Charles, this was very much a mixed experience. He found the freezing cold weather, the emphasis on outdoor education, the bullies, that Gordonston could be very trying in that way. But Prince Charles discovered a great love of amateur theatricals and greatly enjoyed acting in plays. And so his enthusiasm for the theater was there as well. And being in Scotland, he was close to the Scottish estate of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who would often visit and get him out of Gordonston for breaks. So that was something that was also a very warm memory as well. Train travel significant here as well. There is another image that was posted in the press showing Prince Charles departing the overnight train all the way from Murray, where Gordonston's located, through to Euston Station in London. That he'd taken the overnight train in order to meet his new younger brother, the who was then Prince Andrew, now the former Prince Andrew in disgrace. But at the time of then Prince Andrew's birth in 1960, his older brother, Prince Charles, was able to travel by train, and then again for the birth of Prince Edward in 1964. So getting to Scotland by train was certainly very much a part of Prince Charles's childhood. And there were steam trains around the Balmoral estate. So Prince Charles, in 2017, got to drive a childhood steam train that his donation had helped restore after there was vandalism of this historic steam train. The Prince of Wales has driven a steam train that his donation helped restore after it was badly damaged by vandals. Charles, known as the Duke of Rothesay in Scotland, wore a kilt and a specially monogrammed overall to drive the steam engine on a line in Aberdeenshire that he used to travel on as a child. The prince stepped in with a significant donation through his charitable foundation after hearing vandals had smashed windows on a 1965 railway carriage and ruined a locomotive engine at the historic D-side line at Milton of Crafts in Benchury in August 2015. So we can see this is, as I mentioned previously, for the future King Charles III, railways aren't simply transport, but their heritage as well. And the vandalism of this particular train led to him making a substantial donation to ensure that it would be restored. And so he got to have the opportunity to drive the childhood steam train. We also see King Charles III shares his late father, Prince Philip's interest in engineering and technology. So, this is one of a few instances that we're going to see where he actually gets to be behind the controls in a train and gets to help drive the train. His father, Prince Philip, was the same, always wanting to see how things worked over time. Um, um, as Prince of Wales, the future King Charles III had an investiture at Carnarvon Castle in 1969. Few images here from the investiture, which it seems like a very historic occasion, but in fact, it was very much stage managed in a way to ensure that the television cameras were able to get all of these sweeping vistas of Carnarvon Castle, and we see Queen Elizabeth II's wearing a Tudor style hat. There's a lot of heritage that, in a sense, is being created for this moment. A previous Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, who abdicated in 1936, he got to have an investiture in 1911. And so there were precedents for this particular occasion, but it's notable the current Prince of Wales, Prince William, has not had an investiture of this kind. declined. The investiture was preceded by Prince Charles, who was then studying at Cambridge, doing a sort of study in Wales term at the University of Aberystwyth, where he learned Welsh so that he would be able to make a speech in Welsh. And during his time as Prince of Wales, he had a Welsh estate and made efforts to engage with Wales as much as possible, as this particular ceremony was extremely controversial at a time of Welsh nationalism, and there are many Welsh people who felt that an English prince was being parachuted in to have this title of Prince of Wales. The eldest son of the monarch had been bestowed with that title of Prince of Wales all the way from the defeat of Llewellyn the Last by Edward the First, Edward Longshanks. There were centuries of English princes of Wales, but with the rise of Welsh nationalism in the 20th century, that was not well received. Here we have a protest against the investiture taking place outside of Carnarvon Castle, and this had an effect on the railways. There were a couple of Welsh nationalists who tried to mine the rail lines, and the bombs exploded, prematurely, costing them their lives before they got to the railway. But this was a real concern, and Prime Minister Harold Wilson insisted on there being decoy trains used in the run up to the investiture of the Prince of Wales because of a fear of an assassination attempt by extremist Welsh nationalists. The use of trains along the North Wales coast was sanctioned personally by the Prime Minister, according to government papers. So the railways were seen as a security risk amidst all of this. Nowadays, it's interesting to see that there's been some scrutiny of which rail lines were open in 1969 in order to allow, those Welsh people who were in favor of the ceremony to be part of the crowds there. And so now we see articles noting some of these rural rail lines that were open in 1969 have since been closed, and there have been calls for these rail lines to be opened up once more. So it's interesting to see that there's been some decline in some of these rural rail lines. And now people look back at, well, where were we in 1969 or in other previous eras when there were more of these particular rural rail lines. Certainly, when I visited Carnarvon Castle back in 2014, I was lecturing on a cruise ship that came into Holyhead, and you could take the train as far as Bangor, but from there you needed to take a bus on to Carnarvon. Whereas in 1969 there were all sorts of other train possibilities in order to get right near to where the ceremony was taking place. So the flip side of that was that the railways were viewed as a security risk as well. Prince Charles undertakes his first Canadian tour in 1970. The occasion was the 100th anniversary of Manitoba, which had become a province in 1870, and the Northwest Territories. This tour attracted a lot of attention because it was the first time Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, and Princess Anne were all traveling together overseas. The royal fashions attracted attention. We could see a very rare image of the Queen and Princess Anne, wearing trousers on an official engagement, and that was because of the black flies in the Northwest Territories. So skirts were unadvisable at that time. So there was a lot of historic significance to this tour, but there was also current event significance as well. The Cold War was underway, and the United States was concerned about the Arctic, and there were particular American politicians who questioned Canada's sovereignty over the Arctic. So there was nothing like a big royal tour invited by the Canadian government to make very clear that this was Canadian territory, as the press followed the royal family around Manitoba and the Northwest Territories. So there was a lot of interest in this particular tour. They visited communities on the Arctic Circle that had never received a royal visit before, such as, Tuktoyaktuk and Iqaluit. And they met with Inuit peoples, people who were engaged in the fur trade, and were able to connect with people from all walks of life because Prince Charles and Princess Anne were present. There was an emphasis on connecting with young people. Of course, you can see here, there's Prince Charles in the suit and the pocket handkerchief, ready to meet with a young person there who's wearing a muscle shirt. So we can see there's that it's not not quite that young people are all getting together and it's not clear who's royal and who isn't. It's very clear who's here on a royal engagement, but there was much more participation of younger people because there was the younger generation of the royal family present. And in Manitoba, the easiest way for 5.5 days around Manitoba, getting to Brandon, Winnipeg, and Le Pas and Thompson, that this is where train travel became very significant. So the Manitoba government issued a press release that there would be a wide-ranging series of events that are listed in the proposed itinerary of the 5-day royal tour. The closely timed programs designed to let the royal family see as much of Manitoba and her people as possible and to be seen by as many Manitobans as possible. To this end, special side trips have been arranged for the Prince of Wales and Princess Anne, in addition to a heavy schedule for Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh, and for the royal family as a group. So, for many people who, when Queen Elizabeth II passed away in 2022, and there were many Manitobans who reminisced about this tour in 1970, often the train played a very big role in their memories, and the importance of the overnight train for getting the royal family from one place to another when they had a lot of Manitoba to cover before continuing onwards. We can once again, yeah, you see the royal fashions. Princess Anne here is wearing a stylish mini skirt, as she's not yet up in Black Fly country in the Northwest Territories. You see, the Queen's distinctive hats, the suits with the pocket handkerchiefs. So it's interesting to see that there were so many different perspectives on this tour, whether focusing on this being in some ways the last revival of there being a royal train journey for a royal tour, though there would be another in Ontario and Quebec for Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip for the Silver Jubilee in 1977. People who were focused on the fashions, people interested in the Cold War politics, those who were interested in the connections that were being made with Indigenous peoples in Manitoba and the Northwest Territories. This was really a tour where there was a perspective for everyone who was interested in following these events, whether political, fashion, trains. There were so many aspects of this tour that captured the popular imagination. Another tour that does not involve trains, but instead involves underwater travel, was in 1975 while serving in the Navy. The future King Charles III, as Prince of Wales, went under ice diving in Resolute Bay. And this attracted a lot of attention from the press. This didn't seem like the safest thing for the heir to the throne to be doing. So Prince Charles demonstrated the inflatable diving suit and how that worked. And the press really enjoyed this. And it was also a contrast with Queen Elizabeth II, who always in her public engagements presented a very dignified public image. Prince Charles wasn't afraid to have a fun moment in front of the press, inflating a diving suit, showing how it all worked. And so the press found that to be very endearing at that particular time. Of course, around the time that Prince Charles was undertaking his round the world naval service, he had met Camilla Shand, and and it was a case of meeting the right person at the wrong time. That Charles was leaving on these naval engagements. Camilla, while he was away, marries Andrew Parker Bowles, and Charles noted in his journals about just hoping that that empty feeling would pass. So Camilla will be re-entering this story later in the lecture, but they meet in the 1970s when it's not the right time. And also there was an expectation that the future King Charles III would marry into the titled aristocracy at that time. A generation later, the definition of the ideal royal bride would change, but at that time there were a lot of ideas of what a royal bride should be like. So there was increasing pressure on Prince Charles to marry. Here's another fun royal tour, the Montreal Summer Olympics, and this is one of the rare cases of Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, and all four of their children traveling together overseas because Princess Anne was competing in the equestrian events in the Montreal Summer Olympics. There was some controversy about this, about how would Quebec receive Queen Elizabeth II, who would be there opening the games as Canada's head of state, plus Princess Anne was competing. So even though the polling data leading up to this royal tour indicated that there was less enthusiasm in Quebec, once they arrived, they were very well received. And it turned out there were all sorts of spending controversies related to the Montreal Olympics that really overshadowed any critiques of the royal family in the press. And the public enjoyed just seeing the royal family there as Olympic spectators in good weather and in rainy weather, enjoying the events. Princess Anne sadly had a fall from her horse and didn't do particularly well. Her daughter, Zara Phillips, did much better, getting a silver medal in the 2012 London Olympics. So many generations of equestrians within the royal family. The Montreal Metro was expanded with new trains that will be in service all the way until 2036. At this time, the royal family did not get to take the metro in Montreal, but the mayor had been hoping that with the Olympics coming, that the metro system would expand further and further into the suburbs, and expanded to some degree, but eventually the cost overruns were so high that there was a moratorium on any kind of additional spending. So on the day of the Montreal's mayor inaugurated the Longueuil station in 1967, he promised a vastly expanded network in the near future. A week later, the fledgling city of Laval announced a deal in principle to extend the metro there, though Laval ultimately rejected the plan 6 years later over the funding issues. And while Mayor Jean Drapeau envisioned a sprawling network reaching the suburbs, the rise of car culture in the suburbs as growing political clout would ultimately derail his plans. Of course, that pun's got to be there in an article about a metro line not expanding as far as expected. And this is from an article in the Montreal Gazette called The Metro at 50, The Clash with Car Culture. So the Olympics was taking place at a time when all of this spending was happening. It was being scrutinized. And among that scrutiny was just how far the metro was going to expand. So, of course, the Montreal Metro is now in 2026, 60 years old. I mentioned there being a lot of scrutiny of Prince Charles. Who would he marry? Here he is in a railway hotel, the Fairmont Royal York Hotel here in Toronto. Some of you, if you're visiting the Railway Museum in person, maybe staying there as it's quite close by. And so Prince Charles was there for events related to his regiment, where he is colonel in chief. He has a number of Canadian military patronages, and it turned out there was a secretaries convention happening at the Royal York Hotel, and he got mobbed by excited office administrators while leaving the Royal York Hotel. They all thought he looked quite dashing in his uniform. So at a time when King Charles III is now viewed as this very grandfatherly figure, it's important to keep in mind that at this time he was being viewed as the eligible bachelor who was attracting all the attention while visiting Toronto. And a couple of years later, he would marry Lady Diana Spencer, and many people would watch the wedding on television and envision that this was a fairy tale coming to life. When in fact, although Charles and Diana, Althorp, the Spencer estate, and Sandringham, one of the royal family's estates, are not that far apart from one another. So in a sense, she was the girl next door. They didn't know each other particularly well when they married, and so there were problems that emerged relatively early. But in the early days of their marriage, the public was absolutely bowled over by the royal fairy tale. Here's Charles and Diana visiting Canada for the first time together in 1983. Huge crowds came out for this occasion that was marking the 200th anniversary of the arrival of the United Empire Loyalists to Canada. So they spent a lot of time in the Maritimes in particular. there, and then traveled across Canada. Diana's birthday was on Canada Day, so there was a lot of interest in her birthday. The CBC coverage at the time shows a lot of regular people just giving Charles birthday cards and gifts to give to Diana. And we start seeing the earliest instances of there being some tensions, that Diana was definitely getting most of the press attention, and that would have been a new experience for Prince Charles to, in a sense, be overshadowed by someone else, as Diana became an international celebrity whose public profile very much transcended her role within the royal family. On one of Charles and Diana's later trips to Canada, they had the opportunity to ride the SkyTrain in Vancouver, and open the SkyTrain there for Expo 86. Now, when we see coverage of Expo 86 related to Diana, often the emphasis was on, yeah, some of the difficulties she had with her health. She fainted at that time, and yeah, was struggling, as it later turned out, with an eating disorder. And so modern coverage focuses on how clearly Diana was beginning to struggle. Charles would look back on 1986 as when the marriage had irretrievably broken down. But at the time, there was once again so much public interest in Charles and Diana, and it had the effect of publicizing the SkyTrain, that other countries were interested in this kind of transport. Could they have SkyTrains of their own? So everywhere Charles and Diana went, there was enormous publicity, and that was the case for the SkyTrain. Here they are on another train that same year, taking the tube to Heathrow Airport to open Terminal 4. So we see Diana getting to try out the controls. Charles, who had had a polo injury there, you see his arms in a sling. Also, getting to see, how the tube is being operated. So these images are from the London Transport Museum, and we see at a time when there were increased tensions in their marriage, it seems like Charles and Diana were having a nice day out, riding the tube and going to Heathrow Airport. And it would be a few decades before Charles was back on the tube that he would be, back to open a station long in the future, with his second wife, the now Queen Camilla. But 1986 seemed a bit like the year of Prince Charles and trains, between the SkyTrain and the tube. Charles and Diana with William and Harry. I did a tour of Ontario in 1991, and you can sort of tell by the body language there, with on the right with Charles and Diana, that their marriage was not going well, and they would very soon separate the following year. The iconic image of this tour was not a train, but the Royal Yacht Britannia in Toronto Harbor, where Diana embraced her sons, William and Harry. Charles, of course, also embraced his sons after he had greeted the various dignitaries, but that was not the photograph that went all the way around the world. Diana's spontaneity in, scooping up, her two little boys after all this time undertaking royal duties, that was seen as a real sign that she was a breath of fresh air within the royal family. William and Harry had the opportunity to go up the CN Tower and to go to Niagara Falls with their mom, and do the Maid of the Mist. So all the things you do when it's your first visit to Toronto. So William and Harry got to have that experience there, and of course, Harry later in life would spend a lot of time in Toronto visiting his later wife, Meghan Markle, while she was filming Suits, and they would be there for Invictus Games in 2017. So long relationship with Toronto ensued. Diana, after the separation 1992, the divorce in 1997, sadly died in a car accident. Sorry, the divorce in 1996, sadly died in a car accident in 1997. And there was a lot of scrutiny of Charles as a single father, that he was now in this role of parenting his sons in the aftermath of this tragedy. And he brought them to Canada in 1998 so that they could go skiing at Whistler. So, of course, there's a lot of sympathy for the boys who had just lost their mom, a lot of interest in Charles, making an effort for them to have time together as a family in the aftermath of this tragedy that had struck. This tour has received additional interest in popular culture because it's the only Canadian royal tour, as far as I remember, that made it into the Crown on Netflix series that you see all the teenage girls holding up signs about how much they love Prince William. So it made it into the Crown on Netflix. There's a lot of other very important Canadian tours that sadly did not make it into that series, so are not quite as well known today. Charles married Camilla Parker Bowles in 2005. Yeah, as I say, after he had divorced, and then there'd been Diana's passing. Camilla had divorced as well. They had a civil wedding with a religious blessing, and then they visited Canada in 2009. Didn't get the big crowds that Charles and Diana had received. Part of this, of course, relates to Diana's star power versus Camilla being a more understated figure, but also it was November and the weather was not quite as conducive to there being big crowds of people outdoors. We see normally royal tours happen over a holiday weekend like Victoria Day or Canada Day, which enables the crowds to come out to a greater degree. They visited Dundurn Castle in Hamilton, where Camilla's ancestor, her great great grandfather, Sir Alan McNabb, had been a a premier of the province of Canada prior to Confederation. So there was some celebration of Camilla's Canadian ancestor and also a lot of engagement with philanthropy and military patronages. This is one of my favorite royal tour photos. Here we see Prince Charles at the Yonge Street Mission trying out the DJing equipment, and this photograph attracted a lot of attention worldwide with captions like "Every day one is shuffling," and it was noted that Charles and Camilla really seemed to enjoy each other's as company. There wasn't the sense of one outshining the other, but that they seemed to very much, build each other up, and that they enjoyed their travels. In this case, celebrating Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee. 2014, we see the 100th anniversary of the First World War. Prince Charles is looking a little concerned with one of the carvings he's looking at there. They're meeting with RCMP officers as well. This tour attracted some controversy because Prince Charles was rumored to have had an off-the-cuff conversation where he was critical of Vladimir Putin, which at the time attracted controversy. Now that's seen as very prescient. The concerns that Charles was expressing about what had happened in the Crimea and the wider threat to the global situation. 2017, 150th anniversary of Confederation. Charles and Camilla visiting Iqaluit and Prince Edward County and the National Capital Region. And in all of these recent tours, we don't see the train taking on quite as much significance, but we do see the train looming large in popular culture. And in 2020, for the 75th anniversary of Thomas the Tank Engine, Thomas and the Royal Engine, this special episode was created where we see a young Prince Charles with Queen Elizabeth II. Thomas has to get Sir Topham Hatt to the royal event. And of course, we see the royal train, who is called the Duchess of Loughborough, in the context of Thomas the Tank Engine being there as well. So the royal family, it's interesting. We see the future King Charles made many appearances in British popular culture. He cameoed on Coronation Street as well, and an animated younger version of him made it in to Thomas the Tank Engine. And this episode was actually introduced by Prince Harry as that had been recorded in January, really just before before just before it became clear that Harry and Meghan would be departing from their roles as senior members of the royal family and heading off to North America. So the release was in April of 2020, and some of the other news related to Harry and Meghan at that time ended up overshadowing the release of this particular episode of Thomas the Tank Engine. Uh, the future King Charles III and the future Queen Camilla were back in 2022 for the Platinum Jubilee tour, spending time, in the National Capital Region, but also in the Northwest Territories, in St. John's as well, in Newfoundland. So they were able to travel very widely in Canada in just a 3-day period, and this was very much a tour that necessitated a lot of travel by air. Train travel seemed to belong to an earlier era when there was a lot more time for extended royal tours that crossed the country, or at least crossed a whole region, whereas these shorter, more targeted royal tours lend themselves to air travel instead of train travel. So Charles III succeeds to the throne in 2022, and then his coronation takes place in 2023. And so we have some imagery, this very beautiful anointing screen. All the leaves have the names of the different Commonwealth countries. There was much more visibility for the Commonwealth realms in this context. Emphasis on interfaith dialogue, that various faith leaders were there as well, community leaders. Previously, coronations had been seen as a great gathering of the aristocracy, but King Charles III made an effort to ensure that his coronation had this wider cross section of people from the Commonwealth and in the United Kingdom as well. Most British aristocrats understood. For instance, Pamela Hicks, formerly Pamela Mountbatten, the daughter of the late Lord Mountbatten, said that this was quite right, that she'd already attended 2 coronations, those of George VI and Elizabeth II. But there were a few other aristocrats, like the Duke of Rutland, who believed that they should be invited. So this was very much a blend of tradition and modernity, and we can see that blend of tradition and modernity as well, coming together in subsequent royal tours. Here is King Charles III and Queen Camilla last year, there for the state opening of Parliament. And this took place in the temporary Senate chamber, which is in the building that recently was a conference center for the Houses of Parliament. But until the 1960s, this was Ottawa's railway station from 1912 to the 1960s. And there have been a few previous railway stations on that site as well. So there was some railway heritage there in the setting. As with the 1970 Royal Tour, the global situation was very significant. This was at a time when there were threats south of the border to make Canada the 51st state. And by having King Charles taking on these tasks as head of state, reading the speech from the throne, that this was a way of making very clear that Canada had its own history, its own political institutions that were very different from that of the United States. So we can see Prime Minister Mark Carney, King Charles III, and Queen Camilla. King Charles continues to be enthusiastic about train travel, even though it's not as much of a part of these big royal tours as has been the case in the past. And he celebrated his 77th birthday last year at the controls of a tram train within the depot, the official opening of the South Wales Metro Depot at Taff's Well in November 2025. So trains continue to be very much a part of King Charles III's life and reign, even as we're seeing these shorter, more targeted royal tours that don't include long periods of train travel, as was the case in past decades. lots of biographies of Charles III if you're interested in learning more about his life and reign. I've written a few articles, one for the Canadian Encyclopedia, another for Reader's Digest Canada about his memorable visits to Canada, and I did a piece for History Extra, the BBC History magazine, about his investiture at Carnarvon Castle, some of the Welsh nationalism and the controversies that ensued at that time. These are my own books, Magna Carta and Its Gifts to Canada, Queenship and Revolution, Early Modern Europe, and Raising Royalty, A Thousand Years of Royal Parenting. So for all things royal and historical, the material is there. I also co-edited the English Consort series. The chapter I wrote is about Camilla and Catherine and the future of the role of the royal consort. So there's a chapter from a different academic in each of these volumes about all the various queens and prince consorts over the years. And my next book is going to be about Marie Antoinette and the Enlightenment. So I'm taking a deep dive into late 18th century France these days. Please visit my website, royalhistorian.com, and I'm on LinkedIn and Blue Sky and Instagram as well. Thank you very much for sticking with me for the past hour as we have taken a whistle stop tour of King Charles III's life and reign, and I will be delighted to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that very interesting, very informative talk. I particularly enjoyed how you shared the different intersections between Charles and the visits to Canada, and how the rail history and how rail was used kind of throughout the provinces and how it sort of changed over time. Fascinating photographs as well. I particularly love the photo of then Prince Charles in the lobby of the Royal York, looking very dashing in his military uniform, being mobbed by young women. It is excellent perspective to see it all kind of drawn over 75
Yes.
years. Yes, very good. So I will encourage our audiences. You can now submit a question down in the Q&A of our platform. So Carolyn, we're going to get started here. This is a question from David Mackey. And David asks, how much did security concerns weigh on the decision to retire the Royal Train versus the helicopter, for instance?
I think the issue may have been less about security than about cost and about speed as well. So certainly in 1969, security was a huge issue with the investiture of Prince Charles as Prince of Wales. But we see that Queen Elizabeth II was a very active, active train passenger on the Royal Train, and she undertook a lot of engagements by train, and so it seems that the security situation was addressed. Of course, that had the potential to create other complications affecting the rail schedules for other trains that might be passing on the same line. So the main factors seem to have been cost, speed, and also avoiding any disruption to existing rail services that having a designated royal train seems to have caused seems to have caused these additional expenses. And also, as I mentioned previously, more junior members of the royal family had just been traveling on rail cards and had been able to travel in that way. And so the need for a particular royal train reduced over time. As I say, there were particular times like World War II or the COVID-19 pandemic when it really made sense for the royal family to sort of be in their own space on this royal train. But now it seems as though that it's just seen as a cost-cutting measure to be able to travel regularly, in first class, but still on regular trains, as has been the case for the extended royal family. So that's a very good question. Helicopters, of course, create their own concerns, and there has been speculation that Queen Elizabeth II was concerned when Prince William would pilot the helicopter with his wife Catherine and all their children in the helicopter, as traditionally royalty and their heirs often travel separately because of concerns that something might go wrong.
Excellent. And thank you for the question, David. This next question, Carolyn, is from John Bellsmith. During the Manitoba visit of 1970, it appears that Prince Philip had his arm in a sling. Was he injured? Do you know?
I'm just gonna. I see the photo that you mean, and certainly he has something over his hand. I wouldn't be surprised as with his son if there had been a polo injury at one point, as both Prince Philip and Prince Charles were very enthusiastic polo players. So often when we see one or the other, having their arm in a sling, that's generally the reason why.
Yeah, interesting question. I think that really shows how our audiences, our listeners are really paying attention.
Yes, to look very closely because the sling that Prince Charles was wearing when he was on the tube in the 1980s, that's much clearer. But yes, but yes, Prince Philip, it's hard to tell. It looks like it looks like there's something on his hand at that time, and certainly it was something that both Prince Philip and Prince Charles experienced at various times were polo injuries.
Hmm. Interesting details, and they have lived very fascinating, very active lives.
Yes.
This next question, Carolyn, is from a Lydia Rossiter.
Mhm.
And Lydia asks, do we know if Charles uses Queen Elizabeth's bedroom on the train or Prince Philip's?
I believe he has his own rooms on the train that were developed in the 1980s for, say, when Charles and Diana were undertaking public engagements on the royal train. And it was the same on the Royal Yacht Britannia. They had a honeymoon suite there. So I remember the audio tour on the Royal Yacht Britannia announces this was the first double bed on the Royal Yacht Britannia to set up this honeymoon suite for Charles and Diana. So I believe he had his own train car that he continues to use as king rather than having to take over and redecorate his parents' rooms.
Very good. We have time for a couple more. This is a quick one from Jacqueline. Carolyn, Jacqueline asks, perhaps you mentioned during the talk where the royal train was stored. Jacqueline was hoping you could just reiterate where that might be, and she recalls seeing one in the CP Pavilion in Calgary, next to the Fairmont there.
Yes, there have been different rail cars that have been used on different royal tours that are stored in various museums. Of course, some were decommissioned over time, or some were converted. I believe the Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa has some old royal trains as well from the time of the 1939 royal tour by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. So various railway museums in various parts of the country have train carriages that not only were used for royal tours of Canada, but often governors general made use of trains for extended tours. It's hard to imagine today the governor general taking on a whistle stop tour in Canada, but during the Second World War, the Earl and Countess of Athlone, who were related to the royal family, and they were the vice-regal couple from 1940 to 1946, but they used the train from the 1939 Royal Tour to go around and inspect regiments and munitions factories. So it's interesting to see how train cars are often repurposed over time. So it's not like when there isn't a royal tour that these trains weren't in use, that often governors general were making use of the royal train in between royal visits up until 1959 when the Queen and Prince Philip undertook one of the last big whistle stop journeys across the country by train.
Yeah, that makes sense. And further to that, great segue to one of our last questions from Dave Smith. Um, Carolyn, do you anticipate that the Royal Train, the carriages specifically, will become an exhibit similar to the Royal Yacht? Any idea where it might be located?
Yes, I think it will become a museum as the Royal Yacht Britannia is extremely popular. Of course, the location in the Port of Leith near Edinburgh helps with, it's right next to where the cruise ships come in. So the Royal Yacht Britannia gets a lot of traffic from tourists. And there's a number of royal artifacts that are stored there, gifts over the years. There's a narwhal tusk from Canada that's there. There's a wooden dolphin that's signed by everyone on Pitcairn Island, all 40 of them or so. So all of these really fascinating gifts from various parts of the Commonwealth are there in the Royal Yacht Britannia. So it may well be the case that the Royal Train is turned into a museum. There has been no real discussion about where the train cars would be located, whether it would be the train alone or whether there would be other royal exhibits, as there is with the Yacht Britannia, where there are all these royal gifts as well. So I think that remains to be seen in 2027 where the British Royal Train will be. But King Charles III has placed a very strong emphasis on opening up royal properties to the public, tours at Balmoral, the East Wing of Buckingham Palace as well. So I think it would be entirely part of this trend for the Royal Train to also be opened up to tourists as well.
Indeed, certainly something to watch, and perhaps the Toronto Railway Museum can collaborate with them if it does become a museum exhibition. We can talk about some loans there. Last one for you, Carolyn. It's kind of a fun one from John and Christine Rye. Going back to the very beginning, Charles as a small boy, do you know if he had trains or toy trains to play with as a child? Where did this fascination come from?
Yes, he seems to have had toy trains as a child, a little, toy pedal cars as well. There's a story about, Princess Anne, basically hustling him out of one of those pedal cars because she wanted it. So it seemed as though any toys that he had, his sister Princess Anne, who also shares this family interest in science and technology, that she was also interested in a lot of these, mechanical things, trains and ships. So certainly there were toy trains, and everywhere members of the royal family travel, often they receive gifts, not just official gifts, but from members of the public, to bring this home, for your children. So when King Charles III, as Prince of Wales, was made commissioner of the RCMP, he referenced that as a child he'd had a little, Mountie uniform, and there's pictures of him wearing it that his parents had received on one of these Canadian tours. So really wide range of different toys, and certainly trains, and the opportunity, of course, to travel on steam trains as well was part of that.
That was a very fulsome answer, and thank you.
Thank you. I'm
Um,
seeing some of the comments. I appreciate that. I think it's Andrew says, tell Carolyn she was right. It was a polo injury that caused the Duke of Edinburgh to have his arm in a sling in July. And the 1939 Royal Train is at Ottawa's Museum of Science and Technology. So I'm glad the audience is backing me up on a few of the answers to the questions.
Absolutely. We do have a great audience.
Yeah,
And I want,
wonderful audience.
indeed. And I'd like to thank the audience for coming out this evening, for participating in such a good way, for offering thoughtful questions. And to our speaker, Dr. Carolyn Harris, thank you again for a fascinating lecture.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be teaching a course in February and March at the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies about Richard III. So no trains there, but if you're interested in royalty, you might find that of interest.